Welcome, everyone. My name is Nick Ziegler. I'm research professor at Brown University, and I'm here with two distinguished panelists to discuss a remarkable new book, Reimagining Capitalism in a World on Fire. We're especially lucky to have with us the book's author, Rebecca Henderson. She is John and Natty MacArthur Professor at Harvard Business School and one of Harvard's 24 university professors. She's an international authority on the economics of technological change and business strategy. She's received far too many honors to list right now for teaching as well as scholarship. What is relevant to us today is that she's very deeply engaged in how business organizations can respond to climate change and several of the closely related challenges that face us. We're also very lucky to have as a panelist Richard Locke, Schreiber Family Professor of Political Science and International Public Affairs at Brown, where he also serves as current Provost. Locke is an authority on labor relations and comparative political economy. He also has too many teaching and research awards to list here. And when he's not planning Brown University's response to the current pandemic, he is a very active, widely recognized expert on new work practices and the future of employment in global supply chains. So without taking more time on introductions, I'd like to turn briefly to the book and begin our discussion. This book argues, and here is what it looks like. I'll try to get it properly on screen. Reimagining Capitalism in a World on Fire. It is a remarkable book in many ways that we'll explore. It argues that business corporations, which are of course often seen as the cause of climate change, increasing inequality, and perhaps the growing exclusionary nature of politics in our societies, that business corporations can also lead in finding solutions to these ever more critical problems. So with real thanks to my co-panelists, let me turn to the author and ask Rebecca, as a way of beginning discussion, why you took the time to write this book and why you believe that we can, if we do the right things, actually achieve a reimagined form of capitalism.
Thank you very much, Nick, for your generous introduction and for inviting me to join you today. I wrote this book because the world is on fire. Sometimes people ask me, well, how did you know? The book went to press in October and they say, how did you know the world was going to be on fire? And I say, well, it was pretty obvious. The world was literally on fire last summer. If you think of the fires in California and Australia, and it was clear that where we were going politically was going to lead to the equivalent of social fire. Why do I think business can save the world? I understand it's a completely unlikely idea. And I don't think business alone can address the problems that we face. But I think business could be a powerful ally. Let me explain. The world faces enormous problems, from climate change to accelerating inequality to an increasingly polarized set of governments and enormous difficulty in addressing these problems like climate change and inequality. The obvious solution to these problems is government, is to strengthen our institutions to, for example, regulate the emission of greenhouse gases, or to provide better education and healthcare and perhaps redistributive taxation, to put in place labor legislation that will address the quality of the jobs we create. So the obvious solution to these massive problems is a democratically accountable, transparent, responsible government. But we don't seem to have that. And indeed, governments worldwide are struggling to respond to these major problems. Increasingly, they seem to be very short-term focused, and many governments seem to be sliding towards authoritarianism and what the development economists call extraction. the rule of the rich and the powerful by the rich and the powerful for the rich and the powerful. So what can be done? A critical element of any solution has to be a political and social movement to rediscover the institutions of a strong society, to rebuild a strong independent media, an independent judiciary, and a democracy that's really democratic and responsive to the will of everyone. But as we're trying to get that off the ground, I argue it would be incredibly helpful to have business as a powerful ally. Moreover, I argue that business has a strong economic case for addressing these major problems. I lay out 5 steps through which business could make a difference. So here we go, 5 steps in 5 minutes, and it's more than a 300-page book, but I will do my best to sort of summarize it in 5 minutes. First step, I argue and believe that there are many industries and firms that have the opportunity to invest at billion-dollar scale in solutions to the climate and inequality problems we face. The most obvious, of course, is Elon Musk at Tesla, who looks as though he's going to build a company that that will be the most valuable company in the world's automotive industry on the initially seemingly loopy idea that the whole world was ready for electric vehicles. Or consider a firm like Beyond Meat, which had the most successful IPO in the last 20 years, over $200 million. So the most successful large-scale IPO on the basis of selling soybeans instead of meat. Consider the shifts in recycling, where high-tech recycling is increasingly seen as the future, instead of just throwing the garbage into a hole of the ground or dumping it into the ocean, a source of new raw materials at lower cost than digging them out of holes in the ground. Think about all the firms that are running so-called high-road business models. That is, treating people with dignity and respect, giving them the authority they need to get the jobs done, and giving them some kind of purpose and meaning in their work. Lots of academic research suggests that those firms are at least as likely to survive as more conventionally run firms, and often that they're more productive and more innovative, and most importantly, that they're willing to take the risks on these kinds of business models. Think of the employees who want to work only for a firm that has a purpose and a mission. I knew the world was changing when one CEO said to me, "Rebecca, you know I think this sustainability stuff is bullshit." And I said, "Yeah, Fred," not his real name, "I know that." He said, "But everyone I'm trying to hire thinks it's important." Think about the consumers that are beginning to change their buying behavior. Very few people will pay more for sustainable products, but many people will switch. If you offer them something that's equally good with the same kinds of benefits, they will switch. Think of the firms that are beginning to build green. Nearly a third of houses and office buildings are now built green because saving energy is a 16% rate of return proposition. Walmart took $1 billion to the bottom line simply by redesigning their trucking fleet. So there is money to be made in addressing these big problems. Individual firms can make a big difference. A firm like Walmart can change the lives of hundreds of thousands of people when they start to green their supply chain. High road employment firms are literally high road, much more fun to work for. They change the lives of everyone that works for them. Firms like Elon Musk or Beyond Meat can change the trajectory of an entire industry by showing that a technology is possible and taking down its cost. Think about what's happened to the solar power industry, where prices have fallen much faster than anyone expected, because pioneering firms took the lead and really drove those technologies down the curve, helped, of course, by the taxpayers of Germany and China. So individual firms moving can make a difference at billion-dollar scale. They are, of course, not enough. Even if every firm on the planet said, "Okay, I'm going to pick up those business cases that let me make money and make a difference," it would not be enough to address the problems we face. So second step, firms are finding that they can cooperate with each other to make a difference against these problems. Take, for example, the case of Unilever and sustainable palm oil. Unilever committed to buying only sustainably grown palm oil because their headquarters building was being swarmed by activists wearing gorilla suits. It was super embarrassing. They were worried about threats to the brand. They were worried about the long-term viability of their supply chain if existing agricultural techniques, slash and burn, badly grown products, continued. So they said, okay, let's buy sustainably grown palm oil. Sounds good. 20% more, roughly, than conventionally grown oil. They couldn't afford it. What could they do? They could persuade all their competitors to do the same thing. They got nearly 70% of the world's globally traded palm oil to agree to switch to being sustainable. So cooperation, self-regulation can be a step in the right direction. It turns out that it almost never works, that these kinds of cooperative groups make enormous progress in textiles, for example. Groups like the Sustainable Apparel Coalition put in place auditing, worked with all their suppliers to try and make sure that there wasn't child labor, that the supply chains were well run and clean and employees were properly treated. Huge progress, significant limitations. There are always firms that don't want to play ball. These large, complicated supply chains, very difficult to audit and regulate. So where do we go next? Firms are starting to realize that they have a collective interest in solving these big problems, that they want everyone to be playing by the rules, that they need guardrails so that everyone can make money, but we don't have out of control climate change and widespread inequality. So where do they look? Two places to look: finance, and I have a whole chapter on rewiring finance and why it might be that the owners of capital might have the incentive to insist that we solve climate change, for example, or possibly that we start treating employees better. And if finance won't carry the ball, maybe government will. I'll never forget the first time I was in a conference with a whole group of chief sustainability officers from many firms saying, okay, the self-regulation's not really working. We're going to have to talk to the government. And so business is starting to rediscover government. I'm seeing it particularly right now, as I'm in conversations with firms that have discovered systemic racism. One might say it's a bit late, but much better late than never. And the murder of George Floyd has really changed the nature of the conversation. And so these firms are saying, what can we do? And okay, let's change how we hire, let's change how we promote, let's make sure our culture actively encourages diversity and inclusion, that people of color thrive in our organizations. We can see the business case. We can see that 20 years from now, half the talent pool is going to be people of color. 20 years from now, half the consumers are going to be people of color. We need to get good at this. But at the same time, they realize that without government action, without investment in education and healthcare, without ensuring that everyone has a shot at good jobs, the actions they do are nowhere near enough. And so there's a gradual rediscovery of the importance of government happening. And I think that's hugely powerful. Not enough, but potentially very powerful. So that's the book. Sorry, I think I took 10 minutes, but as I say, it is more than 300 pages.
Rebecca, thank you very much for a terrific summary. And I know that Rick and I both have many questions, so I'll turn the floor over to Rick Locke to begin.
Great. First of all, thank you, Nick, for putting together this really terrific panel. And thank you, Rebecca, for writing such an amazing book. It's really a terrific piece of scholarship that I think addresses the most important questions of our time. And the way that you've combined rich empirical analysis with examples, with theory, with thinking outside the box, but showing that that thinking outside the box could be in the self-interest of key actors, is really a tour de force. So congratulations on writing really a terrific and very, very important book. So I just had a couple questions, and it's really to ask you to elaborate on some of the points that you just made in the kind of overview of the book. And they're all about issues that I just feel very passionate about and that I've learned a lot over the years from you, why they're important. And the first has to do with these purpose-driven organizations. Having these purpose-driven organizations is one of the key pillars of your proposal for how we can reimagine capitalism, how we can remake capitalism to make it more sustainable and fair. And your book gives some great examples of individual companies, sometimes that were built around purpose, other times that were transformed to be more purpose-driven because of individual leaders. But in the end, when we think about the world, the population of firms out there, these purpose-driven organizations are kind of few and far between, right? There aren't, it's not the majority. And so I guess I wanted to ask you, how does one create or transform, how does one create purpose-driven organizations or transform existing organizations to be purpose-driven? And perhaps even more important, how do we sustain them in a world that is so volatile and where competitive pressures keep rearing their heads?
Let me begin by trying to give us some definition of what a purpose-driven firm is, because there are a lot of firms out there right now claiming that they are purpose-driven. So I think of a purpose-driven firm as one that is authentically committed to a goal beyond profit maximization. Not that they don't care about making money. Firms don't survive if they don't make money, and they can't keep their investors if they don't give those investors adequate returns. But for a purpose-driven firm, the goal of the firm is something larger than making money. Making money is a means to an end, not at the end in itself. And you can tell if a firm is authentically purpose-driven by whether they're willing to at least occasionally spend money in support of the purpose. So if you're only purpose-driven as long as it serves the immediate interest of the short-term bottom line, it's just nice words. But if when push comes to shove, there are times you say, I will not sell guns, to take the example of Dick's Sporting Goods, or I will commit to using only sustainably grown palm oil, even though it's 20% more expensive, and I will find a way, then you are authentically purpose-driven. As you say, they're at the moment reasonably scarce. I think they're incredibly important nonetheless, because it's these kinds of firms that are spearheading the new ways of doing things, the new business models, the new way of approaching capitalism that we need. I also think it's super important to have purpose-driven firms around because they make the old-fashioned maximize shareholder value at any cost capitalism red in tooth and claw less culturally acceptable. It's not a great world to live in where people say, well, I know that burning fossil fuels is destroying the planet and causing enormous health damage to people right now, but hey, I just have to do it. We want firms to at least, I think, we want to move to a world in which it's widely understood that firms should be aware of their broader impacts and should be part of the cultural conversation. And I think the existence of purpose-driven firms actually helps. Sometimes people ask me if I'm worried by all the greenwashing, firms claiming to be purpose-driven and not. And I say, actually not. Because once you claim a mission and you tell all your employees and you tell all your customers, and if you even pick out a little project and start working on it, it makes it harder to behave egregiously badly. Of course, not impossible, but harder. So how do you build one of these firms? If they're so great, why don't we all have them? It's tough. The only way to build an authentically purpose-driven firm is slowly, step by step. Because if you turn around to your employees and your suppliers and you say, okay, I read the book, I've been behaving like a bastard, that was a mistake, love me right now and I'll love you back. I mean, that doesn't work like in personal relationships. It's not going to work at the firm level. In fact, GM tried something very much like that when they reluctantly, after 20 years, decided that treating their employees with dignity and respect might actually be a good idea. They announced that, hey, just trust us. And it didn't work so well. So you do it step by step. You do it first by talking about what the deeper purpose of the firm really is. Most firms, in fact, have a deeper purpose. Very few firms were founded with, hey, let's just get rich. Real human organizations usually exist for a reason. And so rediscovering the reason the firm was founded is a great place to begin. Most small entrepreneurial firms start with a mission. Let's produce a great product. Let's create great jobs. Let's make a difference. So it's rediscovering that purpose and putting it at the heart of the strategy, focusing on the long term, embracing a high road employment strategy so that you try and embed the purpose deeply in how you manage people and the decisions you make. And then keeping doing it, being consistent. There's no magic. Every human, except a few psychopaths, understands what it means to run a firm, to make a difference in the world. What it means is you don't tolerate the jerks. That at the margin, you make the decisions that take you in the right direction. It's not that common, but it's much more common than most people think. I know a ton of small firms that are purpose-driven. Think about the small grocery stores that are staying open right now, where the employees are running a risk, where, it's really tough getting the stuff you need, having the people in the store, managing the inventory. No one is doing that for the money. They're doing it because they believe they have a duty to support their community. So it's not a crazy new idea. It's deeply embedded in humans. And indeed, much of American capitalism used to be, at least talk about being managed this way. It's only recently we've become so focused on the money at any cost.
Great. Well, thank you, Rebecca, because I agree with you. I think that it's not return. I like this idea that it takes different steps to build, and returning to one's original mission is a good first step. And I would say that as a consumer of your work, it's not just about private firms, but I think that this returning back, anchoring back to the purpose of what institutions are supposed to be is also really important. I think about this for the world that the three of us live in universities, making sure that we return to what is the purpose of a university. For me, it's becoming an agent of social mobility and positive social change, but also for government. If government's going to regain the trust of its citizens and be effective, how does it return to its purpose? So I think that your argument for firms actually applies equally well to other institutions. Let me pick up on the role of government as a second question, because you've raised this in your introduction, and it's certainly in your book, which is there's so much that firms are doing and can do, leading and building more sustainable economy, but they can't do it on their own. And they can't do it on their own for a variety of reasons. One is because the nature of the problems, climate change, inequality, et cetera, are problems that necessarily can't be solved one firm at a time, or even in collectives of firms at a time. They're just huge systemic problems. And so you've said they need to work with government. They need to work with public authority. And I 100% agree with you there. But there's a debate out there, which is when firms start sort of moving into this space, start doing, help working on trying to improve community, public goods or education or healthcare, pushing on improving minimum wages, et cetera. There's a debate, are they crowding out the state? And are these two actors, public authority and private firms, can they work together as complements, or might they actually be substitutes, or worse still, work at cross purposes? So how do we get states, working with these purpose-driven organizations and even collective institutions to actually solve these issues? How do we make sure that they work together collaboratively and not at cross purposes or even crowding each other out, substituting each other, so that the whole is really not greater than the sum of the parts?
There are clearly huge pitfalls here. At the moment, for example, in the US, the political system is flooded with money. More than 70% of the population thinks the system is rigged against them, that business is writing the rules in their own favor. We're seeing a huge push to privatize public services like education in ways that many experts believe will be very destructive in the long term. So how can I be saying business should get more involved with government? That sounds like making it worse. And it's why I think the first step is for business to push to improve the democracy, to improve the competence and capability of government. Government only works when you have a competent bureaucracy delivering policies that really make a difference to the people on the ground, who in turn elect ethical politicians who at least believe with some portion of their mind it's about the whole society and they have allegiance to the democracy. We've lost that positive reinforcing cycle over time. And so for me, the most important thing is to get that cycle back. That's one of the reasons I think purpose is so important, that we need firms that are explicitly committed to the good of the whole society. And the first thing they should do is lobby to get money out of politics and to stop gerrymandering and to fight back against voter suppression. We see that firms speaking out, for example, on LGBTQX issues have been extremely helpful in moving public sentiment and public policy. And in the same way, I think local businesses should say, when legislatures move to gerrymander and suppress votes, they should say, no, 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 you don't do that. We need a strong democracy to balance us. I understand that in the long term, this society will only thrive if I have a strong partner to work with. Once you have a strong partner, then it's a matter of keeping in your lane. And you can see this happening to some extent in cities across the country and across the world. So in places like Columbus or in Minneapolis, not perfect, but the local business leaders meet together and work with the politicians and the government on issues like education and healthcare. Again, we used to have a history that looked like that, where business people felt they had something at stake in the communities they're in. You're seeing it in, so Rick, I should throw this question back at you. Where do you see it working in the textile supply chains? Some of your papers suggest there's been super positive interactions between firms and local authorities in things like the enforcement of labor regulation. So we know that there are positive examples. I think we have to insist that that's the road we take, that we take the high road.
Yeah, excellent. Thank you. Nick, why don't I turn it over to you?
You know, I have a question that follows, I think quite naturally on both of these issues, but goes back in a way, Rebecca, to your chapter on finance. It does seem in a way that both of your answers to Rick's questions on creating more purpose-driven firms, as well as generating a more productive, but also a clearer division of labor between firms and governments working together, they've both been obstructed by a certain kind of idea that has been so dominant in both business and politics over the last 3, 4, or 5 decades. And it's often called the idea of shareholder value, but it's the notion that market competition can lead to optimal outcomes without any consideration other than monetary or material measures for corporate performance. And you address this very explicitly at several points in the book. My question is, and in a way I'm treading on Rick's research territory here, isn't one way to alter at the level of the firm itself the narrow purpose definitions we've inherited, somehow to strengthen the role of employees in the firm? You write about the Japanese pension fund, and one of the considerations there for a now legendary asset manager, I believe it was Hiro Mizuna, was his realization that the companies in his portfolio were paying beneficiaries, but also their children, and it was an intergenerational trajectory. So in a way, the employees became part of the definition of corporate purpose right away. So the question is, since we know corporate purpose and broadening purpose is not happening all over, it's hard to universalize it, what about simply working to strengthen the role of employees in the way corporations are governed? Wouldn't that help create more high impact firms? Because it's employees of all the stakeholder groups who are likely to have a really long-term interest in the survival of the firm. Many employees want to work for the same organization their whole lives. They want their children to benefit from their retirement benefits. So this would be a one very political step. Just do more to empower employees in the firm. How much of a solution to getting this, these virtuous circles restarted would that be? And is it enough? What does it need to be done in conjunction with?
It could be a partial solution. Simply putting a few employees on the board, to my mind, is unlikely to do much of anything.
Uh-huh.
But moving to something like an employee-owned and controlled firm,
Uh-huh.
or moving to something like we see in Germany, where having employees on the board is coupled with having strong unions that do industry-wide wage negotiations and strong support for employee engagement, that might make a difference. We know that in employee-owned firms, when the employees have control, that a larger share of the profits goes to employees than in regular firms. And we know that they can survive in a competitive world. The largest employee-owned firm, Mondragon, is 15 billion euros in revenue and has survived for more than 30 years. It's a widely diversified industrial conglomerate, very innovative, very successful. So, and employees of such firms end up with higher wages and more savings. The reason it's only a partial solution is that it doesn't do much for employees not in those kinds of firms and for people who are having trouble participating in the labor market. So we see in places like Germany that there is a risk that jobs will divide into the unionized good jobs and the out on the outside temporary, much less good jobs. And you see that here in the US with the rise of the gig economy. And so one would somehow have to find a way to ensure that all firms started to move in this direction or have government policy that worked in concert with the firms. The other problem is it just gets you inequality. It doesn't get you improvements in the quality of the institutions that we so desperately need. And without those institutional improvements, we won't have employee-run firms. So there's kind of a bit of a chicken and egg problem. And it doesn't get you, alas, problems like climate change. Strong unions in coal and other industries have been at the forefront of fighting back against climate change measures because it threatens their own workers' livelihood. So there's still a collective problem for climate change that these kinds of governance issues can't address because there's no business case, right? In general, each individual firm would rather keep burning cheap, dirty fuel because, hey, it makes everyone better off in the short term.
Very interesting. And of course, I'm a big fan of the examples you use in the book from Germany, which is commonly and correctly taken as a rather different version of our current incarnation of capitalism for just these reasons. And it's another reason I agree fully with Rick that this is really a remarkable book from which everybody can learn a great deal. It seems to me your answer suggests very strongly that we need a combination of formal changes, but also a kind of social movement, maybe even a multi-strand social movement. And part of this social movement is to change explicitly the criteria and indeed the metrics by which corporate performance is measured, along with the idea of purpose-driven organizations. This notion of changing the metrics of corporate performance is another big part of the book. I know I want to turn the floor back to Rick, but I wonder if you could say a quick word about ESG metrics in particular and why you think, what they are and why they're promising.
Sure. One way of reading the mess we're in is we got over-focused on me and now. We told people if they cared only about themselves and the short term, that somehow everything would work out. In retrospect, this seems insane, right? The lesson of all the major faith traditions is that focusing only on yourself and the short term is at the very best, to use the Buddhist word, unskillful. I think it's disastrous. One way of reading human civilization is as the attempt to balance me right now with us later. You know, any parent of a 2-year-old knows you spend all your time trying to persuade them that no, you have to share your toys and you can't eat everything right now, you know, save the candy for later. And that's what well-functioning governments do. That's what the faith institutions do. Universities, when they're at their best, are later and us. And so the question is, how do you do that? I mean, it's easy to say that, but what do you actually do? And how do you do it in a firm? Well, if you think that focusing on us and later might actually be a better way to run the railroad, and as I argue in my book and have argued here, I think there's lots of evidence to suggest that for many firms in many industries, if you could get a focus on the longer term and on the broader set of stakeholders and constituencies, you would make more money. Then how do we get more firms to do that? Well, we know that in general, investors are not stupidly focused on the short term. It sometimes feels as if they are. I mean, I have 25 years cumulative experience on major public boards, and I know how frustrating it can be sometimes. But we know that when they can understand what's going on, investors will invest in the long term. Think about Jeff Bezos at Amazon, right? Investors let him run massive multi-million-dollar deficits for nearly 10 years. Think about the large pharmaceutical firms. I was on the board of one. We spent billions of dollars on fundamental biological research that everyone knew wouldn't pay off for 10 to 15 years. So investors will let you focus on the long term if you can give a good story and be precise about the progress you're making towards your goals. Because otherwise, if I turn to my investors and say, you know, I think I'll lose a lot of money this year and next year and the year after, but trust me, in the long run, it's going to be great. I mean, most investors are not going to be convinced. They want metrics. And that's why ESG metrics are so important, because they measure the non-financial aspects of performance, like your investment in employees, like your brand equity, like the things you're doing environmentally that will strengthen your brand and help you with employee retention. So it gives you a way to have that conversation. The other reason ESG metrics are important, and I will finish, is because of the rather creepy fact that between 12 to 15 people control, no one's sure exactly, but maybe 50 to 60% of all the world's financial assets. And they are beginning to get worried that climate change is the largest risk they face. that if you think about it, you can hope to invest in General Motors versus Ford because GM might do a little bit better than Ford, or maybe Apple will do a little bit better than Facebook. But the big money is avoiding catastrophic failures. We really don't want to flood New York and Shanghai and Boston and Mumbai. And it's bad for business. And this group of 12 to 15, they control so much money that they cannot diversify away from this risk. So they are beginning to put pressure on their firms. They say, you know, we don't care. We need to get off carbon. Would you move, please? Well, you need a measure, right? You can't tell if the firms are getting anywhere if you don't have good measures. And I don't think it will, I'm not sure it will happen, but it might happen. They might start to say, you know, the way you treat people needs to change, because this kind of accelerating inequality, this kind of move to autocracy, that's not good either. All the research suggests, by the way, that economies governed by inclusive institutions grow faster and much more sustainably with much higher levels of social welfare. So if those 12 to 15 people know what's good for them, they should be pushing the firms to treat the people well too, and to get their money out of politics. And again, you'd need ESG metrics. So we're beginning to see the NGOs saying, well, you should be reporting how much money do you give and who do you give it to? And are you working to support a better democracy? Because that's better for us all. So ESG is key. I mean, if it's not measured, it's just words.
Thank you.
Let me pick up a little bit on the worker side of things, because Rebecca, you in the book have this wonderful discussion of Taylorism and scientific management versus the theory X, theory Y of McGregor. But it seems to me that in the way that I think you're making a very convincing argument that company leaders are beginning to reimagine what the purpose of their company is, because it's in their long-term interests, even if maybe even the short-term interests. But I feel like there's a real lag on how they still view the workforce. If we just think about what's happened in the last several months, first thing to go, let's cut the workers, lay them off, furlough them, et cetera. And suddenly we have 30 million people in the course of a couple weeks out of work. And as you made a reference earlier, it's not just that we have to change the mindset of management to value the workforce, but even some of the worker organizations have to change their mindset, because they too are in the insider-outsider mindset. Historically racist, exclusive, et cetera. So I'd be curious, as someone who has studied this for such a long time, I remember some of the work that you did on relational contracting within firms and across firms. How do you think we can sort of get our economy to actually value the people who do the work? What are the steps that we could push along?
So pushing politically matters. Legislation like minimum wage, much more ample retraining, making sure that everyone has a shot at decent healthcare and education, no matter where they live. At the moment, there are zip codes here in the US where life expectancy is lower than that of Botswana. In Boston, if you drive just a few miles in any direction, you can come to communities where life expectancy is 20 years less than it is in the rich suburbs like Newton or Lexington. So we clearly need a political movement. We have, as a society, decided there are people we do not value. In business, as you know, this is one of the great, to me, unsolved mysteries. One of my friends who read the book got really angry. He said, Rebecca, it's a nice book, but what we really need is a massive cultural shift in how we think about employees and what we think the purpose of business is, and that you don't talk about that. I go, no, in some ways, that's all I'm talking about. So here's a couple of thoughts. Firstly, why, despite, as I document in the book, at least 100 years of evidence that there is a better way to run firms, do so many firms default to the low road? Even in situations where it's clearly a bad idea. I mean, and the massive layoffs in the COVID moment is a classic example. I'm sure for many of those firms that they will bitterly regret it. Couple of reasons. One, it's easy. I don't have to get engaged with other people. I can sit in my office and run my spreadsheets and try and manage by the numbers. So I think there's something very deep about running a high road firm, that you really need to treat other people with dignity and respect. That means taking the trouble to stop and talk to them and ask about their families and think of them as human beings. There's a firm called Barry Weinmuller, whose motto is, we treat every employee as if they were someone's precious child. That's a ton of work. Really thinking about people that way, that's a ton of work. And if you don't feel like doing the work, it's so easy in the short term to take the shortcut. So it's almost as if we need to grow up. And I'm always reluctant to talk about individual transformation as a key part of what needs to happen, because I'm afraid people will think I'm kind of woojy. But I think that's a part of what we need, is at least a significant fraction of us to understand that it's absolutely in our own interests to treat people as if they are part of who we are and integral to our well-being. I mean, one of the reasons I hope the pandemic might have a silver lining is this phrase, I am not healthy until you are healthy. The idea that essential workers had to keep working because they didn't have enough savings to be able to take a few days off, that they didn't have sick leave. Simple things. So many managers are seeing their employees more as human beings now because they see their dogs and their kids and they see how hard it is. I've had several, forgive me both of you, but men tell me, I had no idea how hard it was to take care of a child all day. And I'm like, oh, really? You know? But I think it's easy if you're rich and have money to insulate yourself. And so we need to find a way through that. And that's too fluffy. I wish I could be more concrete, but we need something like that.
Well, I think what you say is absolutely true. Starting from that premise of seeing everyone as valued. And I think the pandemic, if there is a silver lining, is that we're seeing the unseen. These essential workers aren't just the doctors, they're the medics, they're the supermarket, they're the delivery people. And we're all dependent on them. The mutual dependence maybe is a way of highlighting the importance of work. Let me turn to one last question, which you made reference to at the beginning, which is the current moment that we're living in the United States, a moment of tremendous mobilization against anti-Black racism and systemic violence. Your book doesn't really address that, and of course, you know that hit as of late May. But what we know is that many people believe that racism, systemic racism, is intrinsically linked to our system of capitalism, from the slave trading days and the accumulation that created, to the systemic racism that we've seen in all parts of our society, including the economy. And I'd love to hear your thoughts on how can this proposal of reimagining capitalism help us also address one of really the kind of original sins of American society.
The book talks a lot about genuinely free and fair capitalism. Capitalism based on exploitation is not either free or fair. A capitalism in which your life opportunities and your job opportunities are horribly shaped by the fact that your skin is a different color is not free or fair. To me, much of the systemic racism we face reflects the attempt of a section of the ruling class to maintain control. That by labeling some people as non-people, out people, they have effectively prevented ordinary people everywhere coming together and saying, wait, what is this? I haven't had a pay raise in 20 years. And you, oh, top 1%, you're making so much money that 50 people have more wealth than the bottom half of humanity. In the US, 3 men own more than the bottom half of the US population. To me, that's not capitalism. That's a kind of distorted crony capitalism. And in fact, I think a real capitalism, if we took it seriously, a real capitalism says anybody can play. It's not really free and fair until anyone can play. And for sure, no one can fix the rules in their own favor. So I think we can untangle the two. Of course, it will be hard. But I think it's actually, again, in our long-term economic interest that systemic racism is a drag on the economy, the way it keeps so many talented people out of the workforce or working at half speed. I saw a wonderful piece written by a climate scientist, a Black female climate scientist. And she said, you know what? I want to get back to doing my work, but it's hard to be Black. Now, in the midst of this, I'm explaining to my colleagues why it's so hard to be Black. I'm dealing with the rage and anger that comes up as I think about taking care of my young sons. But what I want to do is climate science. And I think that's happening right across the economy. So, color me naive or possibly just hopeful. But if we can reclaim the original idea of capitalism, which is free and fair competition within the rules of the game, balanced and constrained by a strong civil society and a strong democratically accountable government that speaks for the people, we can solve many of the problems we face, or at least make good progress.
Well, thank you for that. That I 100% agree.
Well, thank you both for fantastically illuminating conversation. Rebecca, thank you for writing the book, and thank you both for taking the time to discuss it. You know, it does seem like our conversation suggests that we need social movements, we need individual change, we need organizational change and political change. Of course, another way of thinking about our conversation is that capitalism has a very good chance of working if it's really open capitalism and democratizing capitalism in all the ways that that phrase suggests is one of the things that, one of the many things that I think your book really suggests. So thanks again for a terrific conversation. It was a great deal of fun, but also very, very illuminating to talk with you both.